there's one thing that's becoming increasingly apparent from our reading of the parables this term, I suspect it is that they're sometimes perplexingly simple, and sometimes simply perplexing. Another way of saying that, perhaps, is that we can often be fairly sure that if a parable seems to say exactly what we expect it to say, we have, at least to some extent, read it wrong. Now, that's not because Jesus, in telling these stories, wants to catch us out, or to pull us up short on our skill as literary critics, but rather surely because he wants to expand our horizons, stretch our imaginations, assure us that his message is bigger and more surprising and more wonderful than we could have considered before. Nowhere is this clearer than with the well-known and well-loved narrative we're thinking about tonight. The story of the man who's mugged on the bandit-haunted road out of the big city, stripped and left for dead by his assailants, ignored by respectable religious professionals hurrying past en route to their pious duties, but treated with tender loving care by the man from the wrong side of the tracks. This story has permeated especially deeply into our cultural consciousness, so much so that it has, I think, a kind of proverbial quality. We all know what it means to accuse others of passing by on the other side, when they fail to respond with compassion to the needs of their neighbours. It was the most natural thing in the world when, in the 1950s, a young vicar in London took the then avant-garde step of establishing a telephone helpline for those in the naked vulnerability of suicidal despair, that his organisation should rapidly become known, as of course it still is to this day, as the Samaritans, those who did not pass by on the other side, but took the time to stop and offer the help that they could. A quick internet search will reveal countless other examples of charitable organisations around the world who also reference our hero in their titles for similar reasons. There are Good Samaritan hospitals, Good Samaritan food banks, and so on galore, providing healing and sustenance to those who've been stripped of their dignity by poverty and injustice, left for dead on the side of the various highways to power and privilege that run through our affluent societies. The story is, of course, disturbing on one level. The Samaritan's compassion is depicted as costly. Costly in terms of time, as his day takes on a shape he hadn't expected when he left home that morning. In terms of material resources, the 2 denarii he gives the innkeeper would have represented a couple of days' wages for a farm labourer. So even assuming the Samaritan was himself a wealthy man, it's hardly an insignificant sum. It was costly too in terms of emotional investment. Our translation tonight tells us that the Samaritan took pity on the victim of robbery with violence, but the Greek of St. Luke's original suggests a rather more visceral response. His guts are wrenched with fellow feeling for the wounded man's sufferings. Interestingly, and as we'll see maybe significantly, that same word is sometimes used in the Gospels to describe how Jesus himself feels in the face of those who approach him for healing. So this is no cheap charity that's being commended, and we know it will likely be costly for us too in similar ways if we take seriously the call to go and do likewise, with which our reading ends. Nor should we ignore the parable's other most obvious implications for our common life, even for our politics, and by that, incidentally, at least as much as the question of how we vote, who we vote for, I mean the question of how we treat those who vote differently, as well as those who think, pray, dress, or eat differently. Precisely because this story is such a familiar part of our cultural furniture, for us the word Samaritan conjures up, if anything, images of generous benevolence, the volunteer at the end of the phone line, the worker in the soup kitchen or the clinic, ministering self-sacrificially to those in need. For the original audience, however, far from being a virtual tautology, the phrase Good Samaritan is pretty much an oxymoron. You can be good, or you can be a Samaritan, but it's pretty much unthinkable that you could be both. Jesus' story, in which the one who is not one of us goes to the rescue of a person in need whose ethnic, religious and political identity is interestingly never disclosed, obviously subverts the stereotypes of mutual mistrust and downright hatred that marked relations between the mainstream Jewish community of Jesus' day and their Samaritan neighbours. Sadly, the lesson that teaches that we should neither limit our own acts of mercy and compassion to those to whom we feel akin, or be surprised when it's the despised outsider who behaves better than we do ourselves in this regard. That lesson is still all too relevant in our world. Here too, surely, we need to learn to go and do likewise. So there is indeed a challenge here for all of us. But on another level, the story may strike us as oddly comforting, I think, precisely because it is so familiar. We know where to place ourselves in this story. We know who we are, or at any rate who we aspire to be, who we are supposed to take as our role model. This is the Good Samaritan. Be like the Good Samaritan. But if there's anything in the thought from which I started that we should beware of feeling that we understand exactly what the parables are saying, maybe we should be just a little cautious here. It's certainly not that there's anything wrong with interpreting our gospel tonight as a call to deeply demanding acts of practical charity, or a call to undermine our pride and our prejudice. On the contrary, that is, after all, pretty much exactly how Jesus himself explicitly concludes the narrative. He does quite unequivocally tell us to be like the Good Samaritan, who exhibits those very qualities. It's not that there's anything wrong with these interpretations then, but I want to suggest there's another way of reading our parable, a way which has roots stretching back to the earliest times in which it was read, which, far from contradicting this one, deepens it, making the story still more destructive of our complacent embracing of an easy life than we might fear, but also perhaps making it ultimately more consoling than we might dare to dream. We've seen that the Samaritan's reaction to the man he goes to help is described by St. Luke with the same graphic vocabulary used elsewhere in the Gospels to speak of Jesus' response to those he heals. Each experiences intimate, urgent compassion, sending shockwaves through his guts at the sight of those in need. And for many of the earliest readers and reflectors on this parable, that is exactly what we should expect, that the Good Samaritan would be described in terms reminiscent of Jesus himself. Because, from St. Irenaeus in the south of France, to St. John Chrysostom in what we now call Turkey, to St. Augustine in North Africa, to the Venerable Bede in the northeast of England, in the first few centuries of the Christian Church's history, many were convinced that Jesus is not simply talking about us in this parable, not simply giving us a moral lesson about generosity and the avoidance of prejudice. He's also talking about himself. And in so doing, he's offering us the resources that will enable us, if we will, to live that lesson to the full. The fine print here differs from writer to writer, but basically the parable is seen as a kind of poem, whose imagery tells the story of Jesus' own life. On this kind of account, each thing that happens in the story stands not just for itself, but also for something else, sparking connections in our imagination, drawing the reader more and more deeply into reflecting on the love and compassion of Jesus, echoed and mirrored in the love and compassion of the Good Samaritan. So typically these accounts begin by suggesting that the man attacked by robbers stands for humanity as a whole, stands for all of us, stripped and violated, weak and shaken up and in need of a saviour. Jesus himself then comes down from heaven to the lowest place of our neediness and hurt, as the Samaritan descends the steep desert track from Jerusalem toward Jericho, and brings us to the hospitality and joy to be found in fellowship in the church, as the Samaritan carries the wounded man to the warmth and light and feasting of the wayside inn. And typically in these readings, even all the little incidental details of the story are shot through with significance. So the 2 coins given to the innkeeper might in one version represent the 2 testaments of the Bible, containing the teaching that will provide for our healing and nourishment, as the Samaritan's 2 denarii pay for the medicine and food the wounded man will need to grow strong again. Another author might see in the oil and the wine used by the Samaritan an invitation to reflect on the healing offered in the Church's sacraments, the oil reminding us of the oil which anoints the newly baptized, the wine standing for the raw materials used in the Eucharist. Yet a third might see the innkeeper into whose care the Samaritan gives the wounded man as an image of the Church's pastors, watching over and tending those entrusted to them. For many of us, of course, this way of reading the parable will at least initially be something of a culture shock, and it's unlikely to appeal equally to everyone. Some will find it strained and artificial, while others, well, I should probably put my cards on the table and say I'm one of those others, will love the way it gives the heart as well as the head permission to respond to the text. But for now, the important thing to notice is how we might allow this kind of reading of the parable to throw into sharper relief the message we're perhaps more used to finding in it, how it might help us to hear again that sometimes inconvenient, but surely undeniable call to go and do likewise. Now, at first sight, that might sound a little contradictory. In some ways, seeing Jesus as not only the narrator of the story, but also its hero, Far from awakening in us uncomfortably a calling to work sacrificially to sustain the needy of our world and to fight against prejudice in ourselves and in society at large, surely this story gives us the perfect excuse to carry on evading these responsibilities. After all, in this reading, we are not to identify ourselves with the Samaritan, the one who generously and indiscriminately spends his resources on the one in abject misery who can do nothing to help himself and must rely passively on the sacrificial kindness of others. That's not us, according to this reading. That's Jesus. We, by contrast, are that abject, passive, miserable one. We are to identify ourselves not with the rescuer, but with the one helplessly in need of rescue. It would be pointless, surely, as well as cruel, to expect a man attacked by robbers and left for dead to drag himself to his feet and make himself useful. And if we're in the same position as that man, nor should we expect any more of ourselves. But here too, beware. Beware of seeing only what we expect. Beware of a refusal to allow the parable to surprise us. You may perhaps have noticed the difference between the two questions of neighbourliness that bookend our parable. The lawyer asks Jesus, and I think it's not necessarily just to him to assume it's not an honest question, who is my neighbour? Who is it to whom I have to show love if I am to be living the life God calls me to live? And the story of the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan and the wounded man is the answer Jesus gives him, suggesting, as we've seen, that it's not enough to be prepared to love those with whom we easily identify, that giving of self for others is to be determined by the depth of their need, not by our allegiances or our inclinations. So far, so very true, and indeed surely so very necessary for us to hear in our fractured societies today. But Jesus, in his turn, poses the lawyer a question, not who is it to whom I owe neighbourly love, to which the answer is, clearly, everyone in need whose path I cross. The question rather is, who is it in this parable who demonstrates neighbourly love? To which the answer, in fact, is equally clear, even if, rather amusingly, the poor lawyer is reluctant to allow the S word to sully his lips in such a context. Which of these was a neighbour? Asks Jesus, and the lawyer replies, the one who shows pity. Effectively, the one who does the neighbourly thing? He just can't bring himself to acknowledge that it was a Samaritan of all people who got the point when the priest and the Levite, pillars of his own establishment, did not. Now that, I think, is a beautifully honest cameo of Jesus the teacher at work, not forcing his point home, but allowing it to resonate with his hearers until, little by little, we can make it our own. And the point here is not only that no one is to be excluded from the scope of our mercy, but that none of us are to exclude ourselves from being merciful. And that in itself is, I think, a word of mercy. Not all of our failures to show mercy, after all, are about self-importance, or our contempt for the victim. Sometimes, perhaps rather often, on the contrary, we long to help, but afraid of our own lack of resources, afraid in a sense of our own unworthiness, we hurry past like the Levite and the priest, cloaking our fear and our shame behind a veneer of being terribly busy about our duties, even in some cases our religious duties. I'd love to stop and help, but I'm running late for church. Perhaps too, heaven help us, some of us are entrapped by an image of God as taskmaster or tyrant that seems to require us to put our religious duties above the simple needs of our neighbours. But if any of that is ever true for us, here too, Jesus' word is a word of mercy. You can be a source of healing and sustenance for your neighbour in their need, because you don't have to rely on your own resources. You have mine to call on. And I want you to call on them, because that is the kind of God I came to reveal. The God who loves you so much that he calls you into cooperation with him as he loves the world to salvation. And here indeed the two ways of reading the parable we've been thinking about tonight come together. It's precisely because Jesus, the Good Samaritan, has tended our wounds that we are raised up to tend the wounds of others, that we are empowered in the final words of the parable to go and do likewise. We don't have to choose. In the end, we must not choose. Between seeing in this parable a reminder of our own broken, needy condition and finding in it a commission to love as we are loved. But there's still something more, still one more surprise. When we say, with many of the earliest interpreters of the parable, that Jesus is the Good Samaritan, we are of course drawing attention to the costly generosity of Jesus in coming to our aid. As the hero of the parable spends his resources for the wounded man by the roadside, Jesus spends his for wounded humanity, teaching, healing, feeding the multitudes who call on him for help. But if Jesus is the Good Samaritan specifically, this isn't about a kind of condescending doling out of charity from on high. This is no fairy tale in which the prince disguises himself as a beggar for a little while, only to rip off his disguise in the final scene and recede once again from the squalor of ordinary human misery into the safe distance of the celestial palace. If Jesus is to be identified with the Good Samaritan, that means he's to be identified with the despised, the rejected, the lowest of the low. That is, after all, how the priest and the Levite, how the lawyer who provokes the parable, how all its original hearers would have thought of Samaritans. It's also, though, how they would have thought of a man condemned to judicial murder at the hands of their nation's occupying power. Crucifixion, the means of execution conventionally used in the Roman Empire for slaves, was, to the Jews, a mark of divine disapproval. This, the lowest of the low, is how they would have thought of a man who, though he'd earlier been heard boasting of his special relationship of sonship to Almighty God, apparently can't use his influence with God to avert the horror of the cross. And his last words include an apparent acknowledgement that God has abandoned him to his humiliation. The lowest of the low, like the Samaritan. The most powerless and abandoned, like the man the Samaritan rescues. Jesus, the Good Samaritan, it seems, comes to rescue violated, beaten, wounded humanity by sharing its fate. If Jesus is to be identified with the Good Samaritan, he's also to be identified with the one who has fallen by the wayside. He knows our pain from within. He knows what it is to be shamed and reviled and utterly weak and utterly marginalised. He knows it all. There's an obvious sense in which that's consoling, because it means that in all our suffering we need never suffer alone. Jesus suffers with us, with the compassion of God himself. But maybe there's a less obvious one too. The early commentators on the story, who, as we've seen, saw mirrored in it the story of Jesus, sometimes read the Samaritan's concluding words to the innkeeper, promising that he would return, as a reference to the second coming of Christ to our world at the end of time. And there's another parable that Jesus tells, according to the Gospel of Matthew, about just that mysterious moment. At his second coming, Jesus says here, some will hear him tell them, "I was hungry and you fed me, thirsty and you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and in prison and you visited me." And these people will be commended and promised eternal life, the eternal life inquired after so eagerly by the lawyer at the opening of our reading tonight. Others will be told, on the contrary, that they failed to do these things for Jesus, and that consequently they will not receive such a blessing. Both groups are equally bemused. "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or sick or imprisoned?" And Jesus' answer echoes down the centuries. "Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these my brothers and sisters, you did it to me." When, in other words, we emulate the Good Samaritan in our care for our brothers and our sisters, we're not merely imitating Jesus. At the same time, we are binding up his wounds. We are ministering mercy to God himself. There could scarcely be a more stupendous privilege, or one that more clearly underlines both our own unimaginable dignity and that of those we seek to help. The Good Samaritan has shown us the way we should go. Let us go then, and do likewise.